The laughter echoed across the grand marble-floored living room, bouncing off the high ceilings like a cruel symphony. Glasses clinked, expensive scotch swirled in crystal tumblers, and smug grins twisted the faces of men who had long convinced themselves they ruled the world. Eleanor Hart sat quietly in the corner, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. The soft glow from the chandelier above cast a golden hue over the velvet armchair where she perched, a silent observer in a gathering where she was nothing more than the punchline to a joke. Daniel Morrison, her husband of 8 years, leaned back against the bar, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, wearing the effortless arrogance of a man who had never once faced consequences. He smirked as he poured another drink, his voice dripping with amusement. "Eleanor, honey, you should really think about applying at the new cafe downtown. I hear they're looking for baristas, maybe even dishwashers if you work really hard." Another round of laughter erupted. Ethan Gray, senior executive of Hart Tech, wiped tears of mirth from his eyes. "Yeah, I mean, at this point, even an unpaid internship is a step up." David Carter, head of product development, added with a grin, "Or maybe she should try tech support, since she's been so passionate about tech all these years." More laughter, more smugness, more underestimation. Eleanor lifted her wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid inside, watching the way it caught the light. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile before taking a slow sip. They had no idea. To them, she was a failure. A woman who had spent years trying and failing to land a job. A woman whose career had never taken off, who relied on her successful husband to maintain a life of luxury. What they didn't know, what none of them could even fathom, was that she was the reason they had their jobs in the first place. Hart Tech Industries, the multi-billion-dollar tech empire they all worked for. The company that had built their careers, funded their luxury cars, and paid for the overpriced watches they now flaunted. She owned it. She had built it from the ground up before any of them had even heard its name. But through a web of shell companies and front-facing CEOs, she had remained the phantom architect of the empire, hidden in plain sight. And now, sitting there, listening to them mock her, she realized just how deeply satisfying tomorrow would be. Once upon a time, Daniel Morrison had been different, or so she had believed. They had met at a charity gala in New York. Back then, he had been charming, supportive, or at least he played the role well. "Don't worry, Eleanor," he had said once, back when he still pretended to care. "You'll find your place in this industry. Just keep trying." She had loved him then. She had let her guard down, believing that this time, maybe, just maybe, she had found a man who saw her for more than what she could give him. But success doesn't change people. It reveals them. The moment he realized she wasn't the helpless, struggling woman he thought she was, the moment he understood that she didn't need him to survive, something in him had shifted. The support turned into subtle condescension. The admiration soured into resentment. And slowly, the mockeries began. At first, it was quiet insults at dinner parties. Then it was open laughter among his friends. And now he didn't even bother hiding it. "Hey, Eleanor," Daniel called out from across the room. "Maybe you should start a blog. One of those I tried to get a job for 10 years and failed type of stories. Could be a real hit." More laughter. That was the moment she felt it. That sharp, precise click inside her mind. The final gear snapping into place. For years, she had played the long game. Observing, waiting, strategizing. Now it was time to execute. She set her wine glass down, her fingers brushing the cool crystal rim as she let out a soft chuckle, one that went unnoticed amidst their roaring laughter. Tomorrow morning, these same men would wake up believing it was just another day. They would put on their tailored suits. They would stroll into Hart Tech's headquarters. They would sit in their executive offices, blissfully unaware that within a few hours, their entire world was about to collapse. She stood from her seat, adjusting the silk sleeve of her dress, the diamonds on her wrist catching the chandelier's glow. "I think I'll head upstairs," she murmured softly, playing the part of the defeated wife one last time. Daniel barely glanced at her, waving her off with a smirk. "Big day tomorrow? Another rejection waiting for you?" She smiled. A real, genuine smile. Oh, something like that. And with that, she ascended the grand staircase, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood. The sound of a queen stepping into checkmate. The heavy mahogany door locked behind her as she entered the private study, the only place where her true identity existed. A touch of her hand against the bookshelf triggered a hidden panel, revealing a sleek, modern workspace. 3 monitors glowing with the real-time operations of Hart Tech. This was her domain. She sat at the desk, fingers gliding over the glass surface, pulling up the live security feeds of the men downstairs. Their laughter still echoed faintly through the walls. Her phone buzzed. A message from her most trusted executive, Sophia Carter. Final documentation secured. Board members briefed. Tomorrow's meeting confirmed. Eleanor exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Words he had whispered to her as a child, long before she had stepped into the world of power and deception. Success isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about waiting, watching, and knowing exactly when to strike. The perfect moment had arrived. Downstairs, Daniel and his friends were still drunk on their own arrogance, blissfully unaware that this would be the last night they would ever hold power. Tomorrow they would learn the truth, and when they did, they would realize, too late, that the woman they had been mocking wasn't just their equal. She was their ruler. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, staring at the 3 monitors casting a cold glow against the darkened walls of her private study. The hum of technology, the silent heartbeat of her empire, pulsed through the room. Hart Tech, her creation, her legacy. A kingdom built in secret, its queen hidden behind layers of corporate veils. Tomorrow the world would know her name. But before she could dismantle the men who had mocked her, she allowed herself a moment to remember how she got here. Because power, true power, isn't seized in a single night. It's built in the quiet hours, brick by brick, in the shadows where no one thinks to look. And she had learned that lesson the hard way. She had once believed in fairness. As a child, she had watched her father build his business with nothing but grit and a relentless drive to provide for his family. He had been a man of principle, a man who believed that if you worked hard enough, if you played by the rules, success would follow. But the world doesn't reward good men. It devours them. Eleanor was 17 when she saw her father lose everything. One day, Hart and Sons Manufacturing had been a thriving enterprise, a small but respected player in the industry. The next, it was swallowed whole by a corporate giant with a boardroom full of men who never built anything but their own fortunes. They had smiled, shaken hands, and signed papers that stripped her father of his life's work. She had stood in the corner of that office, too young to be taken seriously, too old to forget the way her father's shoulders slumped when he realized he had lost. That was the day she understood. The world didn't care about good men, cared about leverage. And if she wanted to survive, she would need to stop playing by the rules others had written. She put herself through business school not just to learn, but to observe. While her classmates dreamed of 6-figure salaries and job offers from elite firms, Eleanor studied something more valuable: power dynamics. She watched how deals were made, how influence was brokered, how the true players in the industry never sat at the interview table, but controlled who got the seat. By the time she graduated, she had already begun laying the groundwork for what would become Hart Tech. It started with a single strategic investment, an acquisition so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things that no one even noticed. A failing cybersecurity firm, undervalued, overlooked. Eleanor saw potential where others saw failure, and she bought it under a shell company, concealing her ownership. Then came another, and another. She built an empire in pieces, scattered across different industries, connected by invisible threads that only she could see. And then, when the time was right, she merged them all into one entity, Hart Tech Industries, a company that appeared overnight, fully formed, financially untouchable, and aggressively competitive. By the time the world took notice, it was already too late. She had won before they realized they were playing the game. But even as she claimed her throne, she knew she couldn't step into the light. Not yet. Because men like the ones who had destroyed her father's business, They would never follow a woman who had built something greater than them. They would try to destroy her, just as they had destroyed him. So she stayed in the shadows, letting figureheads and carefully selected CEOs act as the face of the company while she orchestrated its every move from behind the curtain. And for a time, that was enough. Until she met Daniel Morrison. It wasn't love at first sight. Eleanor had learned not to believe in fairy tales. But Daniel was charming, confident, the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention effortlessly. He was everything she had been conditioned to see as desirable, ambitious, charismatic, respected in his field. More importantly, he didn't know who she was. She met him not as Eleanor Hart, the architect of Hart Tech, but as a struggling consultant working on small-time projects. She wanted to see if he was different, if he could love her for who she was, not for what she owned. For a time, he played the part well. "You'll get there, Eleanor," he had told her once, brushing his fingers through her hair. "You just need the right opportunity." She had smiled at him then, thinking, "I don't need an opportunity. I create them." But she had let herself believe, had let herself fall into the illusion that maybe, just maybe, this man saw her for more than the potential wealth she had chosen to keep hidden. So she married him, and that was her mistake. Because Daniel hadn't been different. He had simply been patient. The change was gradual. At first, it was the subtle dismissiveness. The way he started correcting her in conversations, even when she was right. Then came the mocking encouragements, the kind that sounded like support but were laced with quiet condescension. "Keep trying, sweetheart. Maybe next year will be your year." She had smiled through it, played the role of the grateful wife, all while expanding her empire in silence. But then, as if sensing that she was slipping beyond his control, Daniel had begun to sabotage her. She noticed her business proposals mysteriously getting rejected when she submitted them under a different name. She caught wind of whispers in the industry, rumors that she was unreliable, lacking experience, not worth the investment. And when she traced those whispers back to their source, Daniel, her own husband, had been the one orchestrating her failure. And that was when she knew. He had never truly supported her. He had only supported the idea of being superior to her. And now that illusion was cracking. So he tried to bury her before she could outgrow him. But what Daniel never realized, what no man in that room downstairs understood, was that Eleanor had never been waiting for his approval. She had been waiting for the right moment to end him. The clock on the wall ticked softly as she leaned forward, fingers gliding over the tablet in front of her. A file opened, displaying the finalized documentation for Daniel's termination. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into Hart Tech headquarters as the VP of operations. By noon, he would walk out as a man without a title, without a job, without power. And by evening, the world would know the truth. That the woman they had mocked, the woman they had dismissed, had always been the one holding the cards. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. Eleanor never believed in revenge for the sake of vengeance. That was for people ruled by emotion, by fleeting anger that burned bright but faded before it could do real damage. No, what she believed in, what she had spent years perfecting, was calculated destruction. The kind that didn't just remove obstacles but ensured they could never rise again. And so, as she sat in her private office, the dim glow of her screens illuminating her calm expression, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel Morrison was a dead man alking. He just didn't know it yet. She had spent months gathering the kind of evidence that didn't just get a man fired. It annihilated him. Every careless email, every falsified report, every whispered deal made in dimly lit lounges where he had thought no one was watching. But Eleanor was always watching. Her network of investigators, analysts, and insiders had been tracking every move Daniel and his inner circle made. And now the pieces were finally in place. She clicked open a folder labeled Final Report, Morrison and Associates, her eyes scanning the files with the precision of a hunter inspecting her traps. Expense reports. Daniel had been inflating corporate expenditures for years, funneling money into personal accounts under the guise of business development. Leaked corporate strategies. His meetings with Heart's competitors were no longer just rumors. They were now recorded, transcribed, and timestamped. Harassment complaints. The evidence was damning. The testimonies chilling. Women who had left the company. Their careers shattered. Their voices silenced by hush money and NDA agreements. Eleanor's grip on her stylist tightened. Not anymore. Tomorrow, those NDAs would mean nothing. Tomorrow, the world would hear their voices. She switched screens, pulling up a live security feed of Daniel's home office. He was there now, oblivious, leaning back in his leather chair, laughing at something on his phone. Probably another joke at her expense. Her lips curled into a smirk. Let him laugh, because by this time tomorrow he'd be begging. There was a knock at her office door. Sophia Carter, her most trusted executive and the only person who knew the full extent of her plan, stepped inside, tablet in hand. "Everything is in place," Sophia said without preamble. "The board is on standby. Legal is ready to initiate the non-compete clauses the moment the terminations are finalized." "And the press?" Eleanor asked, taking another sip of her now-cold coffee. Sophia's eyes gleamed. "Embargoed reports are prepped and waiting. The second we pull the trigger, every major outlet will have the full story. No time for him to spin a counter-narrative." Eleanor leaned back, exhaling slowly. The meticulous nature of their work was beautiful in its brutality. "The women?" she asked quietly. Sophia hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Some are willing to come forward immediately. Others need time. But with the NDAs lifted, they at least have the option now." That was enough. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about taking Daniel down. It would be about rebuilding what he had destroyed. At that very moment, one of Eleanor's planted executives, Jonathan Peterson, was seated in an upscale bar downtown, nursing a glass of whiskey while subtly recording everything. Across from him sat three of Daniel's closest associates, men who had spent years lining their pockets with corporate corruption. "Morrison's got nothing to worry about," Ethan Gray slurred, swirling his drink. "Heart's board loves him. Hell, Eleanor's too busy failing at job interviews to even notice what's going on." Peterson took a measured sip of his own drink. "Just keep talking." "Yeah," David Carter added with a chuckle. "She's the perfect kind of wife for a guy like Daniel. Beautiful, obedient, completely out of the loop." Peterson's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. Because in less than 24 hours, these men would know exactly how wrong they were. And they wouldn't just lose their jobs. They'd lose everything. Back in her office, Eleanor watched the live transcription of their conversation. A slow, satisfied smile curling at the edges of her lips. "Perfect," she murmured. She tapped a command on her tablet, flagging the recording for her legal team. This was more than enough to terminate every one of them with cause. No severance, no exit packages, just the cold reality of unemployment and a ruined reputation. She glanced at the time. Midnight. The countdown had begun. But there was still one more thread to pull. Daniel had always thought himself untouchable, but Eleanor had made sure to weave his downfall into his own arrogance. She pulled up another document, one that had been in the works for over a year. Daniel had insisted on a prenup before they got married. He had thought he was protecting his assets, ensuring that if the marriage ever ended, Eleanor would walk away with nothing. What he hadn't realized, what his ego had blinded him to, was that Eleanor had rewritten the terms. In the fine print, buried beneath legal jargon he had never bothered to read, was a clause that ensured that if Daniel was ever found guilty of corporate misconduct, fraud, or infidelity, he forfeited everything. And now, Eleanor had ironclad proof of all three. Sophia placed another file on her desk. "What do you want to do about his personal assets?" Eleanor tapped her nails against the glass surface, considering. "Evict him from the house immediately," she decided. "By the time he realizes what's happening, I want every piece of furniture he loves gone. Every tailored suit boxed and shipped to his mother's house." Sophia grinned. Cruel. Necessary. And then, because she wasn't completely heartless, she added, "Leave him one set of clothes. I'm not a monster." The city stretched out before her, a glittering testament to power and ambition. Tomorrow, Daniel Morrison would walk into Hearttecha's headquarters expecting another day of control and comfort. By noon, he'd be unemployed, bankrupt, and blacklisted from every major corporation in the industry. And by nightfall, he would understand what it felt like to be powerless. The early morning fog clung to the city like a shroud, blanketing the towering skyline in a muted gray as Eleanor Hart watched from her penthouse window. The world outside stirred with the beginnings of a new day, but inside her, there was only calm determination, the kind of calm that came before a storm. She sipped her espresso, savoring the bitter heat as it rolled across her tongue. The taste grounded her in the moment, reminding her that everything she had built, everything she was about to dismantle, was real. Downstairs, in their shared mansion, Daniel was still asleep. She knew this because she had watched him stumble home hours earlier, his gait unsteady. His voice slurred as he whispered something incoherent to himself on the way up the marble staircase. He hadn't noticed her absence at the party. Or if he had, he hadn't cared. He never did. But that indifference would cost him everything today. Eleanor set the empty cup on the window ledge, her fingers resting on the cool glass as she gazed out at the horizon. Across the city, Hearttecha's headquarters loomed like a beacon, its steel and glass facade glinting faintly in the early light. That was her castle, and today she would reclaim it. Sophia arrived just after 6, her presence announced by the quiet click of the front door and the measured rhythm of her footsteps on the polished floor. "It's all ready," Sophia said as she stepped into the room, her voice low but steady. "Security is in position. Legal is standing by. The board meeting is confirmed for 10. Eleanor turned from the window, nodding in acknowledgement. She didn't need reminders. Every move had been planned down to the last detail, every contingency accounted for. "And Daniel?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Sophia smirked. "Still asleep. Hungover, probably." Of course he was. He'd spent the last decade living as if the world would always bend to his whims. Today would be his first lesson in consequences. "Let him sleep," Eleanor murmured. "It's the last time he'll know peace." At 6:30, Eleanor entered Hearttech headquarters through the service entrance, dressed in a simple navy blue suit she had purchased from a department store. It was a far cry from her usual designer wardrobe, but today wasn't about appearances. Today was about making a statement. Sophia met her in the basement security office, where a visitor's badge lay waiting for her on the desk. "Elena Mayfield, interview candidate," Sophia said with a grin, handing over the badge. Eleanor pinned it to her lapel, the name a deliberate reminder of yesterday's charade. They had laughed at Elena Mayfield, mocked her, underestimated her. But today, Elena Mayfield would be the one to watch their world implode. The lobby was already bustling by the time Eleanor arrived upstairs, the hum of conversations and the clack of heels on polished floors creating a familiar rhythm. She had designed this space herself, an open, collaborative environment meant to inspire creativity and innovation. Instead, it had become a playground for the arrogant and entitled. Executives strolled through the entrance, their expensive suits tailored to perfection, their voices filled with the false bravado of men who believed they were invincible. Eleanor sat on one of the leather benches near the window, her hands resting on a copy of Hearttecha's latest annual report. She pretended to read, though her attention was focused on the man who had just entered the building. Daniel. He didn't see her, of course. He never did. He walked past her without a second glance, his phone already in hand as he barked orders to someone on the other end of the line. "No, I don't care what the budget says. Just make it happen. And tell Peterson he's on thin ice." Peterson, the man Eleanor had planted in senior management, now quietly gathering evidence on Daniel's corruption. The irony was almost too perfect. She watched as Daniel disappeared into the elevator, his reflection distorted in the mirrored doors as they slid shut. "Enjoy your last day of power," she whispered under her breath. By the time the board meeting began, The tension in the building was palpable. Rumors had been swirling for weeks. Whispers of changes in leadership, of investigations into misconduct. No one knew the full truth yet, but they would. Eleanor stood in the antechamber outside the boardroom, adjusting the pearl necklace that had once belonged to her mother. The weight of it was both comforting and symbolic, a reminder of the legacy she carried and the responsibilities that came with it. Sophia appeared beside her, tablet in hand. "They're all here," she said quietly. Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. "Let's begin." The doors to the boardroom opened with a soft hiss, and Eleanor stepped inside, the sound of her heels against the marble floor echoing like a drumbeat of authority. 12 pairs of eyes turned to her, their expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Eleanor Hart, founder and CEO of Hart Industries." The room went silent. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and then, slowly, the realization began to dawn on them. She wasn't Daniel Morrison's wife. She was the woman who had built the empire they served. Daniel was the last to react, his face paling as he struggled to process what was happening. "Eleanor?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. She turned to him, her gaze cold and unrelenting. "Yes, Daniel," she said. "It's me. The woman you thought you could control. The woman you tried to destroy." She stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the table in front of him. "These are your termination papers," she continued, "effective immediately, along with evidence of your misconduct, fraud, and corporate sabotage." He shook his head, disbelief clouding his features. "You can't do this," he stammered. "What?" she interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "You're what, Daniel? My husband? My superior? A man who thought he could manipulate his way to the top without facing the consequences of his actions." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're nothing." The room remained in stunned silence as security entered, their presence a final punctuation mark on the moment. Daniel tried to argue, tried to plead, but it was too late. He had built his empire on lies and arrogance, and today it had crumbled beneath him. Eleanor watched as he was escorted from the room, his footsteps unsteady, his voice lost beneath the weight of his defeat. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. And as the doors closed behind him, she turned to the board members, who now sat in tense, fearful silence. "Shall we continue?" she asked, her voice steady and unyielding. Because this wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming her power. And she wasn't finished yet. The moment Eleanor Hart stepped into the interview room, she felt the weight of every decision that had led her here. The sterile gray walls, the long glass table, the row of high-backed chairs. Everything was designed to intimidate. It was a room meant to remind candidates that they were stepping into the lion's den, that their fate lay in the hands of the men sitting across from them. But today, the lions were about to learn that the prey they had been toying with was actually the hunter. She smoothed her navy blazer, her fingers grazing the fake name badge pinned to her lapel. Elena Mayfield, interview candidate. Just another faceless applicant. Just another woman hoping for a job she would never get. She stepped forward, the click of her heels muted against the plush carpet. The 3 executives seated at the table barely looked up as she entered. "Sit," one of them said, gesturing dismissively to the chair across from them. Eleanor did as she was told, folding her hands in her lap, head slightly bowed, playing the part of a nervous, eager-to-please interviewee. This wasn't just an interview. This was theater, and she was about to give the performance of a lifetime. "So, Ms. Mayfield," said the man in the center, Ethan Gray, Heart's head of talent acquisition. He didn't bother looking at her resume, didn't even ask about her qualifications. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp with amusement. "Tell me, why should we hire you?" Eleanor hesitated, letting the moment stretch, as if she were searching for the right words. "Well," she began softly, "I've always admired Hearttech. I believe my skills align with." Ethan held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "That's cute," he said with a smirk. "But let's be honest. You've been between jobs for what, 3 years?" Eleanor dropped her gaze, forcing a small, embarrassed smile. Let them believe they were in control. Let them enjoy their power. "I took some time off," she murmured. "But I've kept up with industry trends and—" "Sure you have," interjected the man to his right, David Carter, head of product development. He didn't bother hiding his smirk. "But here's the thing, Ms. Mayfield. Companies like ours don't take on charity cases." The third man, Mark Reynolds, let out a low chuckle. "I mean, look at her," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't a soup kitchen. It's a Fortune 500 company." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair, but her face remained neutral. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to document their arrogance. And they were making it so incredibly easy. She risked a glance at the glass wall beside her, where the reflection of a security camera blinked innocently in the corner. Perfect. Every smirk, every dismissive wave, every subtle cruelty, it was all being recorded. Daniel Morrison entered the scene like a man who believed he owned the world. The glass door swung open without a knock, and there he was, tall, confident, the faintest trace of a hangover hidden beneath his practiced smirk. He strolled past her without so much as a glance, walking up behind Ethan and clapping a hand on his shoulder. "What do we have here?" Daniel mused, peering at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. His brows lifted in exaggerated surprise. "No way. This is your candidate." Ethan chuckled. "Yup. Thought we'd have some fun with this one." "Wow," Daniel murmured, shaking his head as he leaned against the table. "I mean, I knew you were desperate, Eleanor. But this is embarrassing, even for you." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Eleanor forced a small, self-deprecating smile, the kind a woman wears when she's used to being laughed at. Let them have their fun. Let them believe they were untouchable. Because in precisely 3 hours, Daniel Morrison would be escorted from this building. By noon, Ethan Gray and David Carter would lose everything. And by the time the evening news broke, Hearttech would no longer belong to men like them. Eleanor endured the next 20 minutes in silence as the three men continued their performance of dominance, tossing half-hearted interview questions between inside jokes about other candidates they had humiliated before her. She responded exactly as they expected her to, softly, timidly, just grateful to be given the opportunity. They didn't see her as a threat. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake came when Ethan leaned across the table, smirking as he asked, "And tell me, Ms. Mayfield, what would you say is your biggest weakness?" Eleanor let the silence stretch, pretending to consider. Then she met Ethan's gaze, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "Oh, that's easy," she said softly. "I let people underestimate me." Ethan frowned, clearly thrown off by the shift in her demeanor. Before he could respond, the glass door swung open again, this time with force. A security officer stepped inside, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. "Mr. Morrison?" the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "You need to come with us." The room froze. Daniel straightened, blinking in confusion. "What? Now, sir?" Ethan and David exchanged a glance, their easy confidence faltering. "What the hell is this?" Daniel demanded. "I'm in the middle of—" "You are no longer employed at Hearttech Industries," the officer interrupted. "Your access has been revoked. Please hand over your company ID and leave the premises." The silence that followed was absolute. And then chaos. Daniel exploded. "This is a joke," he snarled, turning to Ethan. "Fix this." But Ethan wasn't moving. David had gone pale, eyes darting toward Eleanor as if suddenly seeing her for the first time. And then the final blow landed. The television screen on the far wall flickered to life, the company's official statement flashing across the news feed. "Breaking news, Hearttech Industries announces sudden executive restructuring, citing evidence of misconduct, fraud, and workplace harassment within senior leadership." A montage of files, emails, recorded conversations scrolled across the screen. And then a video, A recording of this very interview. Daniel's cruel smirk. Ethan's mocking laughter. David's whispered insults. The entire world was watching. Eleanor rose from her chair, taking her time, adjusting her blazer with deliberate precision. And then, finally, she looked Daniel in the eye. "You were right about one thing," she said, voice smooth as silk. "This is embarrassing. But not for me." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. He had already lost. And Eleanor? She had just won the war. The boardroom was silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence, the one that came with power and control. No, this was the thick, suffocating stillness of men who had just realized they were no longer at the top of the food chain. 12 of Hearttecha's most influential executives sat frozen around the long, polished oak table. Some clutched pens, others had their hands resting near untouched documents, but all of them shared the same look of dawning horror, because standing at the head of the table, where Daniel Morrison had always assumed he belonged, was the woman they had spent years dismissing. Their true CEO. Eleanor Hart let the silence stretch. She wanted them to feel it, the shift in power, the realization that everything they had taken for granted was now under her control. Slowly, deliberately, she placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. "Let's begin." Daniel was the first to break the silence. He had remained standing since the security team had escorted him back into the boardroom. His breath short, his eyes wild with confusion. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice teetering between anger and desperation. "What kind of game are you playing, Eleanor?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled a sleek black folder from the stack of documents in front of her and slid it across the table toward him. "Go ahead," she said smoothly. "Read it." Daniel hesitated before flipping the folder open. His eyes scanned the first page, his smug expression faltering as the words sank in. Termination notice. For cause. His mouth opened slightly as he flipped the next page. A list of charges. Corporate fraud. Insider trading. Workplace misconduct. The final document was a legal clause from his own prenuptial agreement. The one he had signed without ever truly reading it. Eleanor watched as his face drained of color. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Oh, it's very possible," Eleanor corrected, sliding into the chair at the head of the table, finally claiming the throne that had always been hers. "And it's already done." The other board members shifted uneasily, their gazes flickering between Eleanor and the man they had once believed was untouchable. Finally, Arthur Sterling, chairman of the board, cleared his throat. He was an older man, sharp-eyed and always pragmatic, the type who valued power over loyalty. "Eleanor," he said carefully, choosing his words as if stepping through a minefield. "I think we'd all appreciate some clarification." Eleanor smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Of course," she said. "I'll make it simple." She pressed a button on the tablet in front of her. The sleek glass screen on the boardroom wall flickered to life, displaying a series of documents, spreadsheets, and security footage. Every detail of Daniel Morrison's downfall laid out in high-definition clarity. "For the past 5 years," Eleanor began, her voice calm, authoritative, "Hearttech has been suffering under mismanagement, fraud, and systematic corruption at its highest levels. Certain executives," her gaze flickered over Daniel's inner circle, now sitting rigid with fear, "have taken advantage of their positions, exploiting this company for their own financial gain." Ethan Gray flinched. David Carter swallowed hard. They knew what was coming. "These documents," Eleanor continued, scrolling through emails and transactions, "detail the unauthorized transfer of funds, the strategic leaks of proprietary technology to competitors, the misuse of corporate resources." The screen changed again, displaying a series of audio recordings. The same conversations from yesterday's faux interview, where Daniel, Ethan, and David had laughed at their own corruption, mocking the very company they had sworn to serve. The boardroom fell into stunned silence as their own words played back at them. "Oh, that's easy," Ethan's voice echoed over the speakers. "We just bury the expenses under marketing acquisitions. Nobody ever checks." Hearttech is just a stepping stone. David's voice followed, casual laughing. The real money is in what we sell off the books. And then Daniel's voice. This company wouldn't even exist without me. Eleanor? Please. She couldn't get a job at a coffee shop, let alone run a business. Eleanor pressed the button again. The recording stopped. She let the words settle, watching as realization bled into their expressions. Then she leaned back, folding her hands neatly on the table. Do you need any further clarification, Arthur? The chairman shook his head slowly. No, he murmured. I think we're all quite clear now. Daniel slammed his hands on the table, his mask of confidence cracking. This is bullshit, he barked. You can't just walk in here and take over. Eleanor raised a single finger, and the room fell silent again. You seem to be under the impression that I'm taking over this company, she said softly, tilting her head. Let me correct you. She reached for another document, this one embossed with Hearttech's official corporate seal. I built this company, she said, emphasizing each word. I funded it. I structured it. I shaped every policy, every acquisition, every innovation. She slid the document toward him. I didn't take over, Daniel. I simply decided it was time to reveal what was already mine. Daniel stared at the paper in front of him, but he didn't touch it. He didn't need to, because he already knew. This was the company's original incorporation document. And on the very first page, beside the words founder and chief executive officer, was her signature. Eleanor Hart. Daniel let out a shaky breath. This isn't over, he muttered. Eleanor finally smiled. A real smile, slow and edged with finality. Oh, Daniel, she said. It was over before you even knew it had begun. The board voted unanimously in favor of the transition. Daniel was stripped of his title, his accounts frozen, his executive privileges revoked. By the time security escorted him out of the building, the press had already picked up the story. Headlines exploded across the business world. Hearttech's silent architect steps into the light. CEO Eleanor Hart reclaims power in unprecedented corporate takeover. Scandal rocks Fortune 500 company. Senior executives ousted amid fraud allegations. The most ruthless corporate play of the decade, and the woman who masterminded it. Daniel Morrison's career was over. And Eleanor Hart? She was just getting started. Daniel Morrison had never known what it was like to lose. From the moment he stepped into the corporate world, everything had come easily: money, power, influence. He walked through life as if the world owed him something, as if he was meant to sit at the top while others scrambled beneath him. And for years he had been right. Until today. Now, as he stood outside Hearttech's headquarters, the weight of his downfall pressing down on him, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Panic. His breath came short, his fingers trembling as he checked his phone for the 100th time. No missed calls. No texts. Nothing. The board had abandoned him. His so-called friends, Ethan, David, Mark, had all disappeared the moment their own careers were on the line. He had spent years dismissing Eleanor, mocking her, underestimating her. And now she had done what no one else ever had. She had beaten him. At that same moment, Eleanor sat in her rightful office, watching it all unfold through the sleek security monitors embedded in the glass wall. Daniel stood there, stranded, looking small for the first time in his life. And it was glorious. Sophia stepped into the room, tablet in hand. It's spreading, she reported, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. The media, the stock market, industry analysts, everyone's talking about it. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass surface of her desk. And his assets? Sophia's lips curled into a smile. Frozen. His accounts were tied to Hearttech's stock. And since he was terminated for cause, he won't see a single cent. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. And the house? Locked, Sophia confirmed. Security changed the codes an hour ago. His things have been packed and sent to his mother's house. It was poetic, really. Daniel had spent years belittling her, telling her she was lucky he let her live in his house. He had never realized the deed was in her name all along. Daniel's first call was to his lawyer. "I need you to fix this," he snapped the moment the call connected. There was a pause. Then, "Daniel," his lawyer sighed. "There's nothing to fix." Daniel's stomach twisted. "What the hell do you mean? This is illegal. I was forced out under false pretenses." "False pretenses?" his lawyer echoed. "Daniel, they have documents, emails, recordings. So, we can fight that." "And the prenup?" Daniel froze. His lawyer continued mercilessly. "I warned you to read the fine print." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. "She set me up," he whispered. "No, Daniel," his lawyer said flatly. "She outplayed you." By afternoon, the news cycle had fully exploded. Hearttek's stock soared. Investors, once hesitant, rallied behind Eleanor, their faith in her leadership shaking the market. Meanwhile, Daniel's reputation crumbled in real time. Headlines flooded every major publication. Red Circle ex-Hearttek VP Daniel Morrison ousted amidst scandal, shocking evidence of corruption exposed. Red Circle power shift at Hearttek. Eleanor Hart reclaims control. Executives fall from grace. Red Circle corporate reckoning. The woman who brought down a Fortune 500 titan. And the worst? Red Circle women speak out. Former Hearttek employees break silence on toxic leadership. Eleanor's move had done more than destroy Daniel. It had freed the voices he had silenced for years. On social media, ex-employees came forward, sharing their experiences. "I was told I'd never make it past mid-level management because I lacked leadership qualities. Guess who told me that? Daniel Morrison. He laughed in my face when I suggested a maternity leave policy. 'You'll just be gone in a year anyway,' he said. Now I'm watching him lose everything. Karma is sweet. I was pushed out of Hearttek because I refused to entertain his business dinners. Today is a good day." The comments flooded in by the thousands. And Daniel? For the first time in his life, he was truly, completely alone. By evening, Daniel found himself at his mother's doorstep, the only place left for him to go. The woman who had once boasted about her powerful son, who had looked down on Eleanor, now stared at him with barely concealed disappointment. "What have you done?" she whispered, stepping aside as he walked past her into the house. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he collapsed onto the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. The weight of everything he had lost settled on him like a crushing force. He pulled out his phone. One name hovered on the screen. Eleanor. His thumb hovered over the call button. And then, after a long moment, he pressed it. Eleanor was still in her office, reviewing the final phase of her takeover, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Daniel. Sophia, sitting across from her, raised a brow. "Going to answer?" Eleanor let the phone ring for a few more seconds, considering. Then finally she picked up. "Eleanor." Daniel's voice came through, rough, hollow. "Please, we need to talk." She didn't say anything at first. Let him sit in it. Let him feel the weight of what he was asking. Then finally, "We have nothing left to discuss, Daniel." "Eleanor, listen." "No, you listen." She cut him off, her voice like steel. "I spent years listening to you, enduring your mockery, your dismissiveness, your arrogance. You spent years telling me I was nothing, that I was worthless, that I needed you." She let out a slow breath. "Now look at you." Silence. Then, "I never meant." "You never meant for me to win," Eleanor corrected. "But I did." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You don't have to do this." "I already did." Another beat of silence. Then, "I loved you, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice raw. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, but there was no pain left, no regret, only finality. "No, Daniel," she murmured. "You loved the idea of controlling me. But now," she smiled, slow and devastating, "now you don't even exist." And then she hung up. The next morning, Eleanor Hart stepped into the sunlight, her first day as Hearttek's public CEO. She had spent years in the shadows, maneuvering in silence. Now, she was exactly where she was meant to be, at the top. And as for Daniel Morrison, he was exactly where he deserved to be, at the bottom. The first domino had fallen. And now, the entire corporate world was watching as the rest began to crash down in a perfectly orchestrated chain reaction. Daniel Morrison was gone, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his influence. But Eleanor Hart wasn't done. Because this wasn't just about removing one man. It was about rebuilding an empire and ensuring that those who had thrived under corruption, those who had turned a blind eye, and those who had laughed while good people were pushed out, never had the chance to rise again. Not here. Not anywhere. By 8 a.m., the media firestorm was fully ablaze. Financial analysts dissected the fallout. Legal experts debated whether Daniel and his inner circle would face criminal charges. Corporate insiders whispered about who would be next. The business world had been rocked by scandals before, but this was something different, because the woman they had underestimated, the woman they had mocked, had executed one of the most ruthless corporate takeovers in modern history. And she wasn't done yet. Inside Hearttek's sleek executive conference room, Eleanor stood at the head of the table, the hum of conversations dying the moment she entered. Around her sat the remaining senior leadership, the ones who hadn't been involved in Daniel's corruption, but who had let it happen. Some looked at her with unease, others with curiosity, all of them with respect. She let the silence settle, then placed a thick folder on the table. "What you see in front of you," she began, her voice steady, "is a full list of operational changes that will take effect immediately." Eyes flickered to the folders, hands hesitating before flipping them open. "Hearttek is no longer the playground of men like Daniel Morrison," Eleanor continued. "This company will be rebuilt from the ground up, with integrity, with accountability, and with leadership that actually earns its place at this table." She let the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "If you cannot uphold those values, leave now." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Nobody moved. Eleanor smiled. Good. As the corporate restructuring unfolded inside, the financial world reeled outside. Within hours of Daniel's public downfall, investors who had once cautiously observed from the sidelines came flooding back in. Blue Circle Hearttek's stock price surged by 18% in a single morning, a level of confidence the company hadn't seen in years. Blue Circle, three of the company's largest clients, who had been quietly considering ending their contracts under Daniel's leadership, signed multi-year agreements under Eleanor's new regime. Blue Circle Hearttek's competitors, once eager to poach its business, were now scrambling, worried about what this kind of leadership shift could mean for the industry. And the final blow? Blue Circle, the board of directors, previously skeptical of Eleanor stepping into a public leadership role, issued a statement fully backing her as CEO, calling it a necessary and long overdue correction. The message was clear. Hearttek wasn't just recovering, it was thriving. And Daniel Morrison? He wasn't just fired, he was erased. But the domino effect wasn't just confined to Hearttek. It was spreading. By mid-afternoon, other corporations were feeling the tremors. Red Circle, a Fortune 500 competitor, Atlas Corp, suddenly found itself under investigation for eerily similar misconduct. Red Circle, several of Daniel's former allies, executives who had left Hearttek before the takeover, were quietly resigning from their current positions, hoping to avoid public scrutiny. Red Circle, a prominent hedge fund, known for backing toxic corporate leaders, suffered a massive withdrawal of funds as investors distanced themselves. What had started as one company purging its corruption had turned into an industry-wide reckoning. And Eleanor? She was sitting at the center of it all, pulling the strings. But while the world watched the corporate landscape shift, Eleanor had one final loose end to tie up. Daniel's inner circle, Ethan Gray, David Carter, Mark Reynolds. They had laughed alongside him, had mocked the people beneath them, had profited from corruption. And now, they were about to learn that silence doesn't equal immunity. Inside a dimly lit law firm in downtown Manhattan, Ethan, David, and Mark sat across from their lawyers, their faces pale, their hands fidgeting against their suit sleeves. "We need a plan," Ethan muttered, his voice tight. "There has to be a way out of this." David leaned forward, whispering, What if we go public? Say Eleanor orchestrated this whole thing to frame us. Mark scoffed. And say what? That we were unfairly caught committing fraud? Grow up, David. The room fell into uneasy silence. Then, the door opened, and Eleanor walked in, dressed in a tailored black suit. The true CEO of Hearttech moved through the room like a storm, silent, powerful, impossible to ignore. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. Instead, she placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. The three men stared at it, hesitant, wary. "This is your settlement offer," Eleanor said simply. Ethan's brows furrowed. "Settlement?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "You will sign a full admission of guilt. You will pay back every cent you siphoned from this company. You will issue a formal public apology." David shook his head. "And if we don't?" Eleanor smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that sent chills down their spines. "Then I release everything." The three men exchanged panicked glances. They knew what that meant. Every email, every recorded conversation, every illegal transaction. "Your choice," Eleanor said, her tone casual, almost bored. "You can walk away with your reputations shattered, but your freedom intact. Or you can fight and spend the next decade in a courtroom before inevitably going to prison." She leaned down, her voice dropping just above a whisper. "Either way, you lose." The men stared at her, faces pale, mouths dry. And then, one by one, they signed. Eleanor Hart had won. Not just against Daniel Morrison. Not just against his toxic inner circle. She had burned the entire corrupt structure to the ground. And from its ashes, she would build something unstoppable. By midnight, Eleanor sat in her office, the glow of the city lights stretching far into the distance. She had spent years in the shadows, waiting, watching. Now she was here, at the helm, in control, unstoppable. And as she picked up her glass of wine, taking a slow sip, she thought back to the words Daniel had once said to her. "You'll never be more than a failure." Eleanor smiled to herself. "Funny," she murmured, "because I've never felt more like a winner." The dust had settled. The war had been won. And yet, Eleanor Hart knew that this was only the beginning. Taking back her company had been one battle. But resurrecting Hearttech, transforming it from a corrupted empire into a beacon of integrity and innovation, would be the true test. Because destruction was easy. Rebuilding, that was where the real power lay. At 6 a.m., the doors to Hearttech's headquarters swung open to a different kind of energy. No longer was it a place ruled by fear and unchecked power. Gone were the executives who had thrived on exploitation and favoritism. And in their place, a new foundation. Employees walked in that morning with cautious hope, exchanging uncertain glances, waiting to see what their new leadership would bring. And then, precisely at 8 a.m., Eleanor Hart took the stage. The company-wide meeting had been announced the night before, but no one had expected her to hold it in the main atrium, where even the lowest-ranking employees could see her clearly. No closed boardrooms, no hidden agendas. This was a new era. She stepped onto the stage, the sound of her heels echoing through the high ceilings, and the crowd fell into a hush of anticipation. The woman they had barely known. The woman they had thought was powerless. Now their leader. Eleanor let the silence settle before she spoke. For years, this company thrived under illusion. Illusions of leadership. Illusions of loyalty. Illusions of ethics. Her gaze swept across the crowd, holding every pair of eyes that dared meet hers. That illusion is gone. The room remained silent, but she could feel the shift. She wasn't just talking to them. She was giving them permission to hope again. If you are in this room, it means you still belong at Hearttech. It means you are here to build something better. It means you are ready to rise from the wreckage and create a company that actually stands for something. She paused, letting the moment breathe. Then, and if you are not? She let the weight of her words hang in the air. You can leave, right now. No consequences, no retaliation. But you will not stand in the way of this resurrection. Silence. Then a single clap. Then another. And another. until the entire atrium erupted into applause. Because for the first time in years, Hearttech had a leader worth following. Eleanor didn't waste time. Within 24 hours, the entire corporate structure had been reworked. Blue Circle departments were restructured. Those who had been pushed into the shadows were now promoted into leadership roles. Blue Circle new policies were implemented. Pay transparency, ethical hiring, employee-first initiatives, things that should have existed all along. Blue Circle toxicity was purged. Several senior managers who had enabled Daniel's reign quietly resigned before Eleanor had the chance to fire them. She let them go, because their absence was more valuable than their presence. By the end of the week, the shift was undeniable. Hearttech wasn't just recovering. It was evolving. Clients who had hesitated under Daniel's leadership were now eager to invest. The company's stock price stabilized, confidence in Eleanor's vision surging. And most importantly, people believed again, because power wasn't just about control. It was about trust. And Eleanor had earned it. But while Hearttech thrived, Daniel Morrison's world continued to collapse. His inner circle had abandoned him. His personal assets had been stripped away, and his reputation was in ruins. There was no coming back from this. But Eleanor wasn't finished yet, because Daniel wasn't just a disgraced executive. He was a man who had hurt people, and Eleanor had vowed to make sure he could never do it again. At precisely 10 a.m., a new legal filing hit the courts. Red Circle Hearttech versus Daniel Morrison. A civil suit demanding the return of every cent he had stolen. Red Circle, a class action lawsuit filed by former employees, empowered by Eleanor lifting their NDAs. Red Circle, a federal investigation into his fraudulent dealings. The evidence provided directly by Hearttech's legal team. By midday, the headlines had changed again. Red Circle, former Hearttech VP faces criminal investigation. Massive financial fraud uncovered. Red Circle, the fall of Daniel Morrison. Legal battles could bankrupt ex-executive. Red Circle, corporate reckoning. The man who thought he was untouchable finally brought to justice. And just like that, his fate was sealed. But the real victory? It wasn't in Daniel's destruction. It was in Hearttech's rebirth. Eleanor hadn't just removed a corrupt leader. She had built something better in its place. And as she stood in her office, looking out over the city that had once laughed at her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, because she had won. And she hadn't just won for herself. She had won for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. For every woman who had been pushed aside. For every employee who had been overlooked and underestimated. For every person who had been told, "You don't belong at the top." She had proven them all wrong. And now, she was just getting started. The game was nearly over. But Eleanor Hart wasn't the kind of woman to leave loose ends. Daniel Morrison had lost everything. His position, his power, his wealth. He had been erased from the corporate world. Reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among executives who once believed they were untouchable. But that wasn't enough. Because Eleanor had seen men like Daniel claw their way back from ruin before. They found new investors, new allies, new opportunities to reinvent themselves as victims. She would not allow that to happen. Because Daniel wasn't just an ex-executive. He was a dangerous man. And this was the moment she would ensure he could never rise again. At precisely 7 a.m., Eleanor walked into her office, her morning espresso in hand, and opened the final set of legal documents. Sophia was already waiting, standing by the window, arms folded. "He's trying to fight it," she said without preamble. Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee, completely unbothered. "Of course he is." Sophia placed a thick folder on the desk. "His lawyers are scrambling. He's trying to argue that the class action lawsuit is built on false allegations, that he was pushed out unfairly." Eleanor smiled faintly. Desperate men always think they can rewrite history. She flipped open the folder. Inside were the final nails in Daniel's coffin, financial records, offshore accounts, backdoor deals. "And what about Atlas Corp?" Eleanor asked, setting her cup down. Sophia's lips curled into a smirk. "They've denied all association with him." After the leaks about his past dealings, no one will touch him. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Good. It was time to end this once and for all. While Eleanor prepared her final move, Daniel was crumbling in real time. His reputation was beyond repair. His financial accounts were frozen, and his allies had abandoned him one by one. He had tried to salvage what he could, reaching out to former contacts, attempting to gather a team to rebuild his empire. But the doors that had once opened for him so easily, now they slammed shut. Red Circle, a prestigious investment firm, rejected his calls, citing ethical concerns. Red Circle, his last remaining friend in the corporate world, removed him from their board. Red Circle, a major news outlet, published an exposé detailing his career of manipulation, fraud, and exploitation. And the final humiliation? Red Circle, his mother, publicly distanced herself from him. "I raised my son to be better than this," she had said in an interview. "I have nothing to say to him." The world wasn't just watching him fall. They were making sure he stayed down. Eleanor wasn't done yet, because she knew exactly what Daniel's next move would be. He would try to sell his story, rebrand himself as a victim, spin a new narrative where he had been betrayed by a vindictive ex-wife who had destroyed him out of spite, and she would not let him. At noon, Eleanor called a press conference. Not through an intermediary, not through a corporate statement. She would speak directly to the world. When she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted with flashes and murmurs, the entire press corps leaning forward in anticipation. The silent CEO was finally speaking. She stood behind the podium, poised, unwavering, completely in control. "I know why you're all here." The murmurs died. "You've read the headlines. You've seen the fallout. And you're wondering if this is over." She let the silence stretch. It is not. The flashes went off again. Hearttech was built on integrity, and it is my responsibility to ensure that the corruption that once festered in this company is never repeated. Her gaze hardened. There will be no settlements, no quiet negotiations, no second chances. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Anyone who has abused their position at Hearttech will face full legal consequences. She reached for the final document, holding it up for the cameras. As of today, Daniel Morrison is permanently banned from working in any corporate leadership role. His non-compete clauses have been enforced across every major industry. And should he attempt to start any new venture, she let the words sink in. "We will be watching." A single beat of silence. Then the room exploded into questions, flashing cameras, reporters scrambling to be the first to break the news. Because Daniel Morrison hadn't just lost his career. He had lost his future. As the press conference ended, Eleanor walked through the halls of her company, feeling the shift in the air. Hearttech had been reborn, and for the first time in years, she could breathe. Sophia fell into step beside her. "So," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "What now?" Eleanor smiled. "Now?" She turned to the glass windows, where the city stretched before her, a kingdom finally under the rule of its rightful queen. "Now, we build something unstoppable, because this had never been about revenge. It had always been about power, and Eleanor Hart had just proven to the world. She was the most powerful woman in the game." The Silent Architect, Epilogue. The Legacy, 2,500 words. The city skyline stretched before Eleanor Hart, golden light reflecting off the towering steel and glass structures. A new era had begun. Hearttech was no longer the company Daniel Morrison had tainted with greed and arrogance. It was hers now, truly, completely, undeniably hers. And as she stood in the executive suite, the one she had always deserved but had never claimed until now, she felt something settle inside her. Not relief, not satisfaction, something deeper. Finality. 1 year later, the world had moved on, but the effects of Eleanor's reign still rippled across the industry. Hearttech was now the fastest-growing tech company in the country, having secured some of the largest contracts in its history. Blue Circle employee satisfaction had skyrocketed, with diversity and equity programs that were now industry standards. Blue Circle stock prices had tripled, making Hearttech one of the most profitable corporations in the sector. Blue Circle Eleanor had been named CEO of the Year, her strategic vision lauded by business analysts, investors, and even former skeptics. But while Hearttech flourished, Daniel Morrison had disappeared. No press, no new ventures, nothing. It was as if he had been erased from the business world entirely. Exactly as Eleanor had planned. She had expected at least one last fight from him, one desperate attempt to salvage the wreckage of his life. But no, Daniel had simply vanished. Until now, a single email appeared in Eleanor's inbox late one night. No subject line, no signature, just 2 words. You won. Eleanor stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A year ago, she might have felt the need to respond, to remind him why he had lost, to deliver one last crushing blow. But now, she simply deleted the message, because Daniel Morrison was already forgotten. And she had everything he had ever wanted and more. Eleanor knew that power wasn't just about taking control. It was about what you left behind. And what she was building would last far beyond her own reign. Blue Circle, she created mentorship programs, ensuring that talented, overlooked employees were given the opportunities she had once been denied. Blue Circle, she expanded Hearttech globally, setting new ethical standards that forced entire industries to change. Blue Circle, she invested in the next generation, knowing that true power was not just holding the throne, but shaping those who would inherit it next. Because true victory wasn't in watching your enemies fall. It was in rising so high that they could never reach you again. Eleanor stood in her penthouse office, a glass of wine in hand, watching as the city pulsed with life beneath her. Sophia stepped in, holding a new report. The numbers just came in, she said. Hearttech is officially the #1 tech firm in the country. Eleanor smirked, taking a slow sip of wine. Of course we are. She turned back to the window, watching the lights of the city she now ruled. Because the game had never really been about revenge. It had been about proving to the world what she had always known. Eleanor Hart was born to win. And now, she would never lose again. Before we close this chapter, I want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in Eleanor's journey? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that power belongs to those who earn it, hit that like button because this story, this victory, it belongs to all of us.